Hey, it's Nancy. Before we begin today, I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Crime Beat early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Audrey Trudeau was a well-respected, successful physiotherapist with a kind and compassionate nature. She put the needs of her patients, family, and friends ahead of her own, always considering the feelings of others. That's why it came as such a shock when she missed her last day of work at the Rocky View General Hospital, along with a farewell party her coworkers had planned. They heard she took a last-minute trip to the mountains, which seemed odd. Then she missed her first day of work at her new job in Ontario. No one had heard from her in weeks. It was all completely out of character and becoming more and more suspicious. Police searched her townhouse and took note of several things that didn't seem to add up. But it was only after forensic crime scenes investigators examined the home that police knew for certain that Audrey hadn't just taken off, and she wasn't just missing.
Investigators now know that something bad happened in that residence.
This is just a tragedy that can't be explained.
It was surreal. It just didn't seem like it was actually happening. It felt like I was watching some B-grade movie that just had a bad director. It was terrible.
I'm Nancy Hixt, a senior crime reporter for Global News. Today, on Crime Beat, I share the turmoil of a family sick with worry, left with unanswered questions, and details of the disturbing discovery that cracked the case wide open a few months later. This is the conclusion of Benevolence Betrayed. As the investigation continued, officers kept detailed forensic evidence gathered from Audrey Trudeau's home as holdback evidence, not widely released outside of the direct team of detectives involved in the case. Officers believed only someone directly involved in Audrey's disappearance would know that information. And given police still didn't know where Audrey was or what had happened to her, they kept that information confidential to protect the integrity of the investigation. By then, she had been missing for 3 weeks. Her coworkers at the Rocky View Hospital were growing more and more concerned. Jane Crosley said she couldn't shake the feeling that something bad had happened to Audrey.
We all decided to try to go looking for her. And we had therapists going out to parks looking for her. I remember driving home from work, looking in ditches to see if there was maybe a body there. It was consuming us.
You'll recall Audrey's roommate, Deborah Point, was a porter at the hospital and worked closely with the physio unit. Point didn't show up for work on Audrey's final day either, but had returned the week after. Willa Martin said she spoke to Point several times following Audrey's disappearance.
There were a few phone calls and I started to take notes because some of her stories weren't terribly consistent. There's something about a family crisis, and then there was something about an ex-boyfriend in BC, and it just started to sort of seem a bit fishy. We knew that Deb was driving her car and wearing her ring after Audrey went missing, and so, we started to think this isn't normal behavior. I had heard from people at the hospital that she had borrowed money from them and not paid them back. And that she'd had a problem with gambling.
Across the country in Ontario, Audrey's family was beside itself with concern. You'll remember that on March 11th, 1999, 2 weeks after she disappeared, Audrey's brother had reported her missing to the Calgary Police Service. So by the end of March, when there was still no update on the case, Audrey's older sister, Frances, decided to take matters into her own hands. She traveled to Calgary and went straight to Audrey's townhouse, which had been listed for sale in mid-February. When Frances arrived, she was surprised to find Audrey's roommate still in the house.
And Deborah and her mother was there, and they were packing boxes. And went in and just, hi, how are you? You know, I'm trying to be nice because I was told by the police I had to be nice. So I was trying. And remember when we were there, and I remember Audrey's ring was sitting on the kitchen table. And I said to her, I said, you know, you said Audrey was away. She said, yeah, she is. I said, no. Audrey don't leave without her ring. She had a beautiful $4,000 sapphire and diamond ring. Beautiful. So anyhow, I said, I'm taking that ring. No, you can't. I'm taking that ring. So I did. And I called the police. The police came over that day. I gave them the ring because it's evidence.
At that point, police were still keeping their cards close to their chest, and evidence of a homicide was growing. Calgary Police Superintendent Cliff O'Brien said detectives dug into Audrey Trudeau's banking records and found a series of transactions that added to their suspicions of Point.
We noticed on February 26th, the day after she went missing, that there was a check that had been cashed from Audrey's account with her name on it. As we continued that investigation into banking activity, we noticed that between February 6th and February 26th, there were 12 checks that totaled just a little over $5,100 that had been cashed. They're forged with Audrey's name on Audrey's account. Again, it doesn't mean that she's responsible for the disappearance, but she's certainly number one suspect.
Police decided to question Audrey's roommate, Deborah Point, again.
So whatever you say, if you're charged with an offense, and then you say between now and then maybe given evidence at a trial, should you be charged? Okay? Everybody emphasizes you're not charged with anything like that. Okay? Alright. Something's happened to Audrey here. Whether she has gone and committed suicide, she died of accidental causes, she was taken out and murdered. I don't know. We have our suspicions, but that's it.
Officers brought up the suspicious transactions in Audrey's financial records.
There's a bunch of checks written on her account. My guess is, if you do a handwriting analysis on it, I'll bet you the signature at the bottom is forged. And I'll bet you did. Is that why her credit lines have been maxed? Because you're forcing her to give you money? You know what I'm suggesting? I'm suggesting it had something to do with the disappearance of Audrey. There's just so many things that point that something happened here to Audrey that we can't explain. And they all point to you. Why did she give you the ring?
Because she didn't want to take it with her. And she didn't want to run. All she said to me is she said, take care of this for me. It's not security. So I have to take care of this for me. So she gave it to me, and I had it in my jeans pocket. And I called my mom and I said, Mom.
You got someone in the hospital say you're wearing it.
I wouldn't even wear that kind of stuff. That's ridiculous. I would never even wear that. Ever.
Deborah Point didn't admit to anything. She denied financial fraud and denied any involvement in Audrey's disappearance. Superintendent O'Brien said following the interview, Point was free to go. No charges were laid.
It's a difficult position to be in as an investigator where you're pretty confident that there's been foul play, pretty confident that you know some of the parties that are involved in it, and yet there's not much you can do at this point. You're continuing the investigation, but you really need a lead. You really need something to come forward that will break open the case. As much as we may do surveillance or we may do other investigative tactics, we're waiting for that one big break.
But that big break seemed to elude investigators. Months passed. Audrey's sisters, Frances, Sheila, and Mary, were inconsolable.
It was hard, very hard from the time that she went missing.
So I ended up in crisis therapy to help me manage the stress. The longer it went on, it was hard to fathom, you know? It was really hard to fathom. Are we ever gonna find her, you know? Where is she, you know? How can she ever, by that, you know, you knew, even though you didn't want to admit it, you knew she was gone. Like, there's just no way she'd be just alive somewhere. That just wasn't even in the cards. We knew she was gone. It was all for me, like, find her so we can deal with it, you know, and bring her home.
You're what if this, what if that, maybe this, maybe that. But it's something, it was a day-to-day thing that you live day-to-day to find out and wait.
In June of 1999, 4 months after Audrey was last seen alive, police put out a news release. It stated that Audrey had disappeared while on a trip to British Columbia. Superintendent O'Brien said they also made a plea to the public for information as leads in the case had dried up.
The case was growing cold. We didn't know where Audrey was, and there wasn't new evidence necessarily coming forward. But we did get a call, seemingly totally unrelated, but we did get a call from a woman who claimed that Deb Point had stolen her credit card and used it fraudulently, and had also done a renovation fraud, essentially. And she said it was Deb Point. It was a friend of Deb Point's.
This was on top of the earlier allegations of fraud that police were already investigating.
We have somebody reporting that Deb Point has committed a fraud against them as well. It would certainly seem to indicate that maybe there's some type of money problems or something that's going on. We know that for sure that she had done at least several forgeries at the time on Audrey's account. So I think what it's doing for us is painting a bit of a picture that Deb isn't as innocent as she may have tried to portray herself.
Again, police questioned Deborah Point. They laid out the caller's claims of credit card fraud, but again, no charges were laid. Then, finally, a break in the case, nearly 5 months to the day after Audrey Trudeau went missing. And it was so much worse than anyone could have anticipated. I need to warn you, details are disturbing. It's one of the most horrific discoveries I've reported on.
On July 21st, the Calgary Police Service received a phone call from a woman that indicated that some people related to her had gone into her garage. It was a detached garage, and had smelled a foul odor coming from what they thought were some boxes that were in there. And the boxes had Allegiance Health stenciled onto the box, and they had in black felt marker the name Chris on one of the flaps, and they were secured with lots of duct tape. And so the homeowner said, "Go ahead and open the box. That's strange. I don't know why there'd be a smell coming." And unfortunately for those individuals, they opened up the box. They noticed that there were lots of mothballs in the box. They noticed that there were multiple garbage bags, and as they opened up, unfortunately, they discovered some body parts.
Human remains.
Human remains.
A massive police presence descended on the home, with forensic investigators and a team of homicide detectives all working to identify the victim. As they dug into the background of this address, they realized the garage housing the boxes in question belonged to the same woman who had gone to police a month earlier, alleging that Deborah Point had defrauded her. Could this be an eerie coincidence, or was there a connection to Audrey's disappearance? To answer those questions, Superintendent Cliff O'Brien said officers needed to first identify the victim. they began the harrowing task of sorting through the contents of the boxes.
What they discovered was that there were 3 boxes. There were 2 smaller boxes and a larger box. The larger box was on like a dolly, and all the boxes had allegiance written on it. They also had in felt marker Chris handwritten on the boxes. And as we opened up the boxes, we discovered the dismembered remains of Audrey Trudeau.
The gruesome discovery made headlines across the country. And that's how Sheila, Mary, and Frances learned of their sister's death and the horror she faced.
I shouldn't have, but I looked at the news and found the circumstances and shock. Like, how could somebody do this to another person, let alone my sister?
I was just told initially that they had found her. And I thought I had a heart attack, to be honest with you, because it's very painful. But when I found out the circumstances, I just got instantly angry. And I was very angry.
My heart's been broken. My family, Audrey, was stripped from me.
Mary's daughter, Angela Wiggins, said she watched as her family crumbled. The grief of finally knowing Audrey was dead, coupled with the shock of learning such grisly details of her death, was just too much to take.
It was surreal. It just didn't seem like it was actually happening. It felt like I was watching some B-grade movie that just had a bad director. It was terrible.
At the same time, back in Calgary, Audrey's roommate was a suspect in the murder and was under constant police surveillance. Superintendent O'Brien said officers witnessed the exact moment that Deborah Point read the news that Audrey's body had been recovered.
There was an article in one of the newspapers in Calgary that indicated that a body had been discovered. It did not have anybody's name in it, but it talked about the address and it talked about a body being discovered. We had surveillance on Deb Point, and we actually saw when she read that article. That would have been her indication that Audrey had been found.
Surveillance teams followed Point's every move.
Deb was driving a station wagon vehicle that belonged to a relative. And one of the things surveillance noticed is that in the back of the vehicle, there were some boxes that said Allegiance Health on it. But there was a one particular point where they lost sight of her. She got out on foot. She had something in her hand and we lost sight of her. She was gone for just a few seconds, 40 seconds, and then she was back in the vehicle. When we went to the general location where she was, we noticed that there was a dumpster back there and that there was a garbage bag thrown into the dumpster. When investigators looked inside that garbage bag, they found a flap from a box that had handwritten in felt marker, black felt marker, the name Chris. It's the exact same writing, the exact same place as what we saw in the garage with the boxes that had the remains of Audrey Trudeau.
You'll recall that in her first interview with police, Deborah Point had asked officers to call her Chris, her preferred name. The evidence was stacked against her. One day after the remains of Audrey Trudeau were discovered on July 22, 1999, her roommate, Deborah Point, was taken into custody and interviewed one final time.
What were you told when you were arrested there, Deb?
I was going to charge for second-degree murder.
Here's what happened. Last night at about 8 o'clock, some kids were cleaning out a garage on 33rd Avenue, and they came upon some suspicious boxes. They check in the boxes and they find some body parts in there. Today at the autopsy, the body parts have been positively identified as Audrey's.
Audrey was in the garage.
Yeah. She was. You're not aware of that?
No, I'm not.
The officer laid out evidence investigators had gathered against her.
The last little while, things have been really starting to go bad for you. We've got you on video down at a bank using Audrey's line of credit and taking money out of an account that we haven't done anything on that. We know you got big time financial problems. We know that your life is slowly caving in on you. Everything's coming to a head. Last night when we go in the garage and find the body, everything caved in on you. Absolutely everything.
I had nothing.
There's nothing left. Just listen to me. There's nothing else. It collapsed last night when Audrey was found. The body was found in the garage. But the evidence is overwhelming. There's lots of evidence. You're being arrested today and you're being charged with second-degree murder. There is nothing, absolutely nothing you can say that's going to prevent that from happening. At the end of the day, you'll be in jail, charged with this offense. If you think that we've been sitting around since February doing nothing,
I'm not saying that.
you're wrong. Do you have access to all the boxes and that kind of stuff at the hospital?
Yeah. I didn't put Audrey in any boxes and nobody helped me do anything that I didn't do.
You're going to have to face the facts, lady. You can sit there and you can say, Dave, I didn't do it. I didn't put the boxes there. You know, I don't believe it. Detective Shaw doesn't believe it. And there are 6 other homicide detectives out there who don't believe it either.
Deborah Point didn't make any admissions during the interview. But investigators felt they had the evidence they needed to take the case to court. Deborah Point was charged with second-degree murder. In October of 2000, nearly 2 years after Audrey Trudeau disappeared, Deborah Point stood trial in front of a jury. Since then, the original prosecutor has sadly passed away. But Hayat Mograbi, senior counsel for Alberta Justice based in the Calgary Prosecution's office, has done extensive work on this case. She said jurors heard evidence of a cold and callous murder.
Audrey had planned to move to Ontario, where her family resides. She had accepted a position as a physiotherapist at a hospital in Ontario. So she was in the process of packing up her life and moving. So this was meant to be a temporary arrangement. And so Ms. Point moved in, and during that time, it was clear that Ms. Point had struggled with an addiction to gambling, and she also didn't have a regular income coming in, and she continued to struggle with that gambling addiction. And it was alleged at the time and found to be proven that Ms. Point forged a number of checks belonging to Ms. Trudeau. The Crown's theory was that there was likely a confrontation between Ms. Point and Ms. Trudeau about the missing funds. And we're talking about $5,000, which is a significant amount of money. And it was at that time that we say the murder happened, after the theft was discovered by Ms. Trudeau.
The prosecution alleged Audrey Trudeau was killed on the evening of February 25th, 1999, the night before her last day of work and her farewell party. Court heard evidence that Point then dismembered Audrey's body and put her remains into 3 boxes, then went on to try to clean up the blood that marked the house. Then, prosecutors revealed the results of forensic testing of samples gathered from Audrey's home. It was the first time this evidence was made public.
DNA results came back showing that there was some blood in the basement, as well as the dining room and the bathroom. And that blood belonged to Audrey.
Court heard the crime scenes unit examined the victim's home twice. Once in March of 1999, and then 5 months later in August of 1999, after Audrey's body was found.
The realtor who was working for Audrey to sell the house had taken pictures of the house to list it for sale, and the police had obtained those photos and compared those photos to the house and noticed that the carpet would have been intact at the time those pictures were taken, and that comforter, which was missing, was also depicted in those realtor photos. So they had some baseline comparison. That comforter was later discovered with Audrey's body in those boxes.
One of Pointe's friends testified that she had helped her move the boxes into the garage where the body was later found 3 days after Audrey was last seen alive on February 28, 1999.
Deborah had asked a friend if she could store those boxes, claiming that there was computer equipment inside. So the friend had helped her move those boxes into the garage and had seen, as a result, had seen that Deborah had moved these boxes in as well. So there was a conversation between the two of them. She helped her, she was there for that. And of course, she could say where those boxes were moved to.
That friend was the same person who had alleged Pointe had defrauded her out of money in the weeks prior to Audrey's body being found in her garage. Police were able to trace the boxes back to the Rocky View General Hospital. A coworker confirmed to police that she saw Pointe taking boxes from the hospital on February 27th, 2 days after Audrey was last seen alive.
There was also the name Chris written on top of the boxes. Chris is a name that Deborah Pointe went by, and many people knew her as Chris as well.
The medical examiner who performed the autopsy on the dismembered remains presented disturbing evidence of a violent murder.
Very graphic. I would say this is probably one of the most graphic cases I've ever seen. The body that was recovered and the pictures that were shown to the jury are disturbing. The injuries were to the back of the head. They were stabbing or bashing type injuries or crushing type injuries. There were 15 of them that were noted by the medical examiner, and again, all to the back of the head with an axe-like weapon. So Audrey would have been completely vulnerable, would have had no opportunity to defend herself. She would have, she was hit, as I said, a number of times, and these were significant, brutal injuries that caused her death.
Deborah Pointe was represented by high-profile defense lawyer Alan Hepner. He said she maintained her innocence and denied all allegations against her.
She didn't do it. She said it just wasn't her, and she stuck by that. I mean, I had to call her because she denied it. Someone's going to deny such a crime of murder and dismembering. And I think she had to testify, and I never, as counsel, if she ever said to me, well, I really did it, but I will never admit it, I mean, I wouldn't have called her to the stand. It was a circumstantial case. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no eyewitness. It was a very strong circumstantial case.
The trial lasted 7 weeks, and then it was up to the jury to decide Deborah Pointe's fate. After 2 days of deliberations, they found her guilty of all charges. Here again is prosecutor Hyatt Mograbi.
She was convicted of what she was charged with, so guilty of second-degree murder and the indignity. With murder, it always attracts a life sentence.
In sentencing Pointe to life in prison with no chance of parole for 20 years, Madame Justice Suzanne Bensler called Audrey's murder an evil and cowardly surprise attack. Pointe appealed, but it was dismissed. She served 15 years of her sentence at the Edmonton Women's Institution before seeking early release.
She is a convicted killer, serving life in prison for the gruesome killing of a Calgary physiotherapist. And now, 17 years after the murder, she wants out of jail. Nancy Hixt has been covering it for us. Nancy?
Linda, Deborah Point is serving a life sentence for second-degree murder with no chance of parole for 20 years. Point is convicted of killing her former roommate, Audrey Trudeau. Today, a hearing was held in front of Alberta's Chief Justice. Point is applying for early release under the so-called faint hope clause. The first step is to have a judicial review of her parole ineligibility. One of the key factors is she's never accepted responsibility for the death. Hayat Moghrabi was one of the prosecutors assigned to the case for the faint hope application.
She was trying to obtain early parole. She was ordered to serve 20 years of her sentence before she could even apply for parole eligibility. And there is a clause in the criminal code that allows a person who is sentenced to life and parole for 15 years or more to apply for early parole. But before they can do that, they have to go before the court and make an application. That is what we refer to as the faint hope clause. So that clause was designed to respond to instances in which there has been a change in circumstances, such that the statutory period of parole eligibility comes to appear harsh and begins to operate in a manner that has been disproportionate to the goals of incarceration. So that's the background of the faint hope. It gives people an opportunity to make the application for earlier parole if they've changed. So in this case, Deborah brought her application after serving about 16 years of her custodial sentence, and there was a hearing to determine whether she met the threshold requirements before she could go before a jury to make that request.
If the Chief Justice rules in Point's favor, the matter will then go before a jury. The ultimate decision will be up to the National Parole Board. So far, Point has served just under 17 years. Family of the victim, Audrey Trudeau, wrote multiple victim impact statements, and they are very much opposed to this application.
Her denial of the offense was a significant factor. Deborah Point, to this day, has not acknowledged that she committed the murder. She continues to deny it. But if you look at the judge's decision, he reiterates what the trial judge said, which was the evidence was overwhelming against Deborah Point.
Point's application was dismissed, and she continued her time in custody. She has never admitted to killing Audrey Trudeau. She was later transferred to Buffalo Sage Healing Lodge. She is not Indigenous, but chose to follow the facility's programming, which has been a particularly sore spot for Audrey's family. Here's her sister Mary to explain.
My father was a full-blood Ojibwe. He was from a place called Manitoulin Island here in Ontario. And my mother's English, so we're half Native. She managed to get out of jail, go to a halfway house run by Indigenous people, and become a warrior, really. You don't learn peace, you don't learn acceptance, you do not learn how to deal with what you did when you never admitted you did it.
In 2021, Deborah Point was granted day parole, and in 2024, she was released on full parole. According to the Parole Board of Canada, Point is in a relationship with another offender who is also on full parole. While on release, she is not allowed to gamble and has to provide documentation of her finances on a regular basis. Point currently lives and works in the city of Edmonton, about a 3-hour drive north of Calgary. For Audrey's family, the anguish is as real today as it was 26 years ago when this nightmare began. I've spoken with Frances dozens of times over the years, and there's never been a time that I don't hear the pain and sadness in her voice.
I promised Audrey I would keep her in jail, but I couldn't keep her there anymore. I just couldn't do it. And it's as raw today as it was then. And personally, I don't think I'll ever get over it. It'll take me to my grave.
Her youngest sister, Sheila, said they choose to cling to the memories of happier times, like the ski trips they took together in the Rockies. But most of all, they remember Audrey for her benevolence, which was so callously betrayed.
She just the most giving person. The world has lost a person that made people happy.
Thank you for joining me, and a special thank you to Audrey's family, Francis, Sheila, Mary, and Angela, for helping me to share her story. Crime Beat is written and produced by me, Nancy Hixt, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Audio editing and sound design is by Rob Johnston. Special thanks to photographer-editor Danny Lentella for his work on this episode. Thank you to Jesse Weisner, our Crime Beat production assistant. And thanks to Chris Bassett, the VP of Network Content, Production and Distribution, and Editorial Standards for Global News. I would love to have you tell a friend about this podcast. There are 6 seasons of stories you can listen to and share. And if you can please consider rating and reviewing Crime Beat on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can find me on Facebook at Nancy Hixt Crime Beat and on Instagram at nancy.hixt. Thanks again for listening. Please join me next time.